The hospital room was quiet except for the soft beeping of machines and the occasional murmur of nurses checking vitals. The sterile scent of antiseptic filled the air, but nothing could mask the overwhelming presence of sorrow. Jack, a frail 10-year-old boy, lay in bed, his once bright eyes now heavy with exhaustion. His parents, Emily and Peter, sat on either side of him, their hands wrapped around his, unwilling to let go. The doctors had delivered the news weeks ago. There was nothing more they could do. The aggressive illness had taken its toll, and now it was only a matter of time. Family members came and went, each visit ending in tearful goodbyes. Jack, though weak, remained strong in spirit. He had always been different, not one to dwell on sadness, but to dream beyond what was in front of him. From the moment Jack could talk, he was obsessed with space. His bedroom at home was decorated with glow-in-the-dark stars, posters of galaxies, and books filled with stories of astronauts who had dared to explore the unknown. Even in the hospital, he clung to his love for the stars. His parents often found him sketching rockets on scrap paper, carefully designing spacecraft that could one day take him to Mars. He memorized the names of every astronaut who had walked on the moon, every planet in the solar system, and every constellation in the night sky. "One day, I'll go to space," he used to say with a determined smile. Even as his body grew weaker, his mind continued to soar among the stars. One evening, as his mother tucked him in, Jack turned to her and asked, "Mom, do you think Melania Trump would come to see me?" Emily was taken aback. She knew Jack admired Melania Trump, not just for being the former First Lady, but because of her work with children. He had seen her on TV visiting hospitals and schools, always speaking with kindness and encouragement. To Jack, she was someone who truly cared. Emily's heart ached. How could she possibly make this happen? But looking at her son's hopeful eyes, she knew she had to try. Emily sat at the small hospital desk, the overhead light casting a soft glow on the paper before her. Her hands trembled as she held the pen, her heart aching with every word she wrote. "Dear Mrs. Trump," she began, carefully choosing her words. She wrote about Jack, the boy with eyes full of wonder and a heart full of dreams. She described how, despite his illness, he had never stopped believing in the impossible. She shared his love for space, his sketches of rockets, and his fascination with astronauts. "He doesn't ask for much," she continued, "but he has one final wish, to meet you. He admires the way you care for children, and in his mind, you are someone who understands what kids like him go through. If there is any way you could visit, even for a moment, it would mean the world to him." Tears slipped down her cheeks as she folded the letter and placed it in an envelope. Peter walked over and wrapped an arm around her, pressing a kiss to her forehead. "Do you think she'll see it?" Emily whispered. Peter squeezed her hand. "We have to believe." They mailed the letter the next morning, praying that somehow, in the vastness of the world, their words would find their way to Melania Trump's heart. Melania Trump was in the middle of a busy day when an aide placed a letter on her desk. She was accustomed to receiving messages from families across the country, but something about this envelope made her pause. She unfolded the paper and began reading. With each line, her heart tightened. She could almost picture Jack, this bright, curious child stuck in a hospital bed, dreaming of the stars. She sat back in her chair, staring out the window, deep in thought. Then she made a decision. "Cancel my meetings for next week," she told her assistant. "I have somewhere important to be." Her team quickly got to work, arranging for her visit to Jack's hospital. But Melania wanted to do more than just meet him. She wanted to bring him something special. That's when an idea struck her. She picked up the phone and made a call. Captain Sarah Vaughn, one of NASA's leading astronauts, was reviewing flight data at Mission Control when her phone rang. "Hello? Captain Vaughn, this is Melania Trump." Sarah straightened in her chair. "Mrs. Trump, what can I do for you?" Melania explained Jack's story, his love for space, his illness, and his wish to meet her. "I was wondering," Melania said, "if you could help make his dream a little more special." Sarah didn't hesitate. "Absolutely," she said. "I have just the thing." A few days later, she arrived at the White House carrying a small glass case. Inside was a meteorite, a piece of rock that had traveled through space for millions of years before landing on Earth. "If Jack can't go to the stars," Sarah said with a smile, "let's bring the stars to him." Melania nodded, knowing this would be a moment Jack would never forget. The hospital halls hummed with an unusual energy. Nurses whispered excitedly, doctors glanced at one another with knowing smiles, and even the patients seemed to sense that something special was about to happen. But Jack knew nothing. He lay in his hospital bed, flipping through a magazine about space, his thin fingers tracing the outlines of distant galaxies. The IV line in his arm barely bothered him anymore. He had learned to live with the constant presence of tubes and monitors. His parents, Emily and Peter, sat beside him, exchanging nervous glances. Then, a knock at the door. Jack looked up, expecting a nurse, but when the door swung open, his breath caught in his throat. Melania Trump stood in the doorway. She was dressed in an elegant white coat, her presence both graceful and warm. The room seemed to shrink around her, and for a moment Jack thought he was dreaming. His wide eyes flickered between his mother and father, as if searching for confirmation that this was real. "Hi, Jack," Melania said, stepping forward with a gentle smile. Jack's mother gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. His father's eyes welled with tears. They had hoped, prayed, for this moment, but now that it was happening, it felt almost surreal. Jack swallowed hard, trying to sit up straighter. I can't believe you're here," he whispered. Melania reached out and took his small hand in hers. "I've heard so much about you," she said, "and I brought a special friend with me." Before Jack could respond, another figure stepped into the room. Captain Sarah Vaughn, a renowned NASA astronaut, stood in the doorway, holding a small glass case in her hands. Jack's heart pounded. "An astronaut?" he gasped. Sarah grinned. "Not just any astronaut. I brought you something very special." Sarah placed the glass case gently on Jack's lap. Inside, nestled on a soft velvet cushion, was a small shimmering rock. "What is it?" Jack asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Sarah knelt beside his bed. "This," she said, "is a meteorite. It traveled millions of miles through space before landing on Earth, and now it belongs to you." Jack's hands trembled as he touched the case. His fingers pressed against the cool glass, tracing the contours of the ancient rock. "You mean, this actually came from space?" he asked in awe. Melania nodded. "Just like the stars you love so much." Jack stared at the meteorite, his eyes wide with wonder. For the first time in weeks, pure joy lit up his face. "This is the best day of my life," he whispered. His parents watched with tears streaming down their faces. Emily reached for Peter's hand, squeezing it tightly. Jack looked up at Melania and Sarah. "Thank you," he said, his voice filled with emotion. "Thank you for being such a bright light in this world, Jack," Melania replied softly. For the next hour, Jack talked excitedly, asking Sarah about space travel, black holes, and the life of an astronaut. She answered every question with patience and enthusiasm, laughing at his clever observations and marveling at his knowledge. Melania sat beside him, watching in admiration. Jack wasn't just a child who loved space. He had the mind of a scientist, the soul of an explorer. Before leaving, Melania reached into her purse and pulled out a small envelope. "This is for you," she said, handing it to Emily. Inside was an invitation. Jack and his family were being given an honorary tour of NASA's headquarters, where he would get to meet real astronauts and see the Mission Control Center up close. Jack's eyes sparkled. "I wish I could go to space someday," he said wistfully. Melania squeezed his hand. "You already belong among the stars." As Melania and Sarah walked out of the hospital room, they turned back one last time. Jack was clutching the meteorite close to his chest, his eyes still glowing with happiness. "Look at him," Sarah whispered. "That's the brightest smile I've ever seen." Melania nodded. "And that smile will stay with me forever." The hospital room, once filled with beeping machines and hushed voices, had transformed into something magical. Jack's spirit was brighter than ever, and with the meteorite still clutched in his hands, he became the storyteller of the ward. Every evening, nurses, doctors, and even other young patients gathered around his bed, listening to his stories about the universe. "Did you know there are planets made entirely of diamonds?" Jack would say, his eyes twinkling. The children gasped. "Or that some stars are so big that if you put one where our sun is, it would swallow up everything, even Saturn." Jack loved teaching them about black holes, distant galaxies, and the endless wonders of the cosmos. His passion was contagious, and for those moments no one in the room was sick, no one was in pain. They were all just explorers of the universe, traveling through the stars with Jack as their guide. His mother, Emily, watched from the corner of the room, smiling through her tears. "He was always meant to be a teacher," she whispered to his father. But deep down, she knew, these were Jack's final stories, and everyone listened, cherishing every word. The night before Jack's condition worsened, Melania Trump visited him one last time. She sat beside his bed, holding his frail hand. Jack turned to her and whispered something so softly that only she could hear. "Promise me something," he said, his voice weak but full of meaning. Melania leaned in closer. "Anything, Jack. Promise me that other kids like me will get to reach for the stars too." Tears filled her eyes. She squeezed his hand tightly. "I promise." Jack gave her a small smile, then closed his eyes, his breathing slow and steady. Melania sat there for a long time, holding his hand, making a silent vow that she would keep that promise. And she did. Jack passed away peacefully that night, surrounded by his parents and the love of everyone who had ever met him. The hospital room felt empty, without his voice filling it with stories of the stars, but his dream did not die with him. Melania, deeply moved by her time with Jack, took action. She began working on something extraordinary, a foundation in Jack's name. She called it Jack's Legacy. The foundation's mission was simple but powerful, to inspire and support terminally ill children who dreamed of space, science, and exploration. Melania spoke about Jack at events, sharing his love for the stars with the world. Donations poured in. Scientists, astronauts, and educators all came together to honor this boy who had never stopped dreaming. Jack's name was becoming something far greater than anyone had imagined. After Jack's passing, Melania Trump was determined to keep the promise she had made to him. She knew that his dream of reaching the stars had to live on, not just for him, but for other children who shared his passion. With the help of generous donors, educators, and space agencies, Jack's Legacy Foundation launched one of its most meaningful initiatives, the Starlight Scholarships. This program was designed to give terminally ill children a chance to experience the wonder of space in ways that Jack had always dreamed of. Through these scholarships, children would visit NASA, meet real astronauts, and even participate in virtual space missions. It was more than just a trip. It was a chance for them to escape their hospital rooms, to forget about their illnesses, and to dream as big as the universe itself. One of the first scholarship recipients was a 12-year-old girl named Lily, who had spent most of her life battling leukemia. She had always loved looking at the stars from her hospital window, imagining what it would be like to float among them. When she arrived at NASA's Space Center, she stood in front of the towering Saturn V rocket, her eyes filled with wonder. For the first time in a long time, she didn't feel like a patient. She felt like an astronaut in training, just as Jack had once imagined himself to be. For every child like Lily, the Starlight Scholarships became more than just a program. It was proof that dreams could outlive even the shortest lives. What began as a single initiative in Jack's memory soon grew into something much larger. The story of the little boy who had dreamed of the stars touched people all across the country, and before long, schools, universities, and even government agencies wanted to be part of his legacy. NASA officially declared an annual Jack Star Week, a nationwide celebration of space exploration dedicated to young dreamers like Jack. Across the country, classrooms were filled with lessons about astronomy, students built their own model rockets, and schools hosted stargazing nights in Jack's honor. Colleges and universities introduced Jack's Dream Grants, awarding scholarships to students pursuing careers in space science, engineering, and astrophysics. Young minds who had once only gazed at the sky now had the support to reach for it. Even the White House recognized the impact of Jack's legacy. Melania Trump continued to share his story, using her platform to encourage funding for STEM education and medical programs for children with life-threatening illnesses. Jack's dream was no longer just his own. It had become a movement, one that was changing lives and inspiring future generations. 1 year after Jack's passing, something extraordinary happened. A team of astronomers who had heard his story decided to honor him in the most fitting way possible. After careful deliberation, they announced that a newly discovered star in the Orion constellation had been named Jack's Star. The star was a brilliant golden light, burning brightly in the night sky, as if Jack himself was watching over the world. When Emily and Peter received the official certificate with the star's coordinates, they held it close, overwhelmed with emotion. That night, they stood on their porch with a telescope, gazing up at the sky. For the first time in a long time, Emily smiled through her tears. "He always said he belonged to the stars," she whispered, "and now he's there forever." News of Jack's star spread across the world, and soon families everywhere were looking up at the night sky, searching for that one special light. The observatory was filled with a quiet sense of reverence as people gathered under the night sky. Families, children, astronomers, and educators had come from near and far, all for one reason: to honor the boy whose dream had transcended even his short life. It had been exactly 1 year since Jack's passing, but his presence was felt more than ever. His name had become a symbol of courage, his dream a source of inspiration, and tonight that dream would shine brighter than ever. A massive telescope was set up, aimed precisely at the coordinates of Jack's star, the celestial body that had been officially named in his honor. One by one, children stepped forward, peering into the eyepiece with wide, hopeful eyes. Some gasped, others whispered in awe, but all of them saw the same thing, a golden point of light burning against the dark fabric of space. Jack's parents, Emily and Peter, stood together, watching as each child took their turn. It was a bittersweet moment, one that filled them with both pride and sorrow. Jack had always wanted to reach the stars, and now, in a way they never could have imagined, he had. His name was forever etched in the cosmos, his story written among the constellations. A gentle breeze moved through the observatory as Emily took a deep breath, gazing up at the sky. "He always said he belonged to the stars," she murmured, squeezing Peter's hand. "And now he's there," Peter whispered back. Around them, people shared stories of how Jack had touched their lives. A young girl in a wheelchair spoke about how Jack's story had given her the courage to pursue her own dream of becoming a scientist. A high school student shared how he had been inspired to apply for an aerospace engineering program because of Jack. Even an astronaut in attendance, who had met Jack during one of his visits, spoke about how his unwavering love for space had reminded her of why she became an explorer in the first place. Jack had never set foot on a rocket, but his journey was far from over. His story was still traveling, still reaching new hearts, still inspiring those who looked up at the stars and wondered. He was no longer just a boy with a dream. He was now a part of the universe itself. For Emily, the days without Jack stretched long and empty. The house was unbearably quiet, missing the sound of his laughter, his endless questions about space, and the excited way he would ramble about planets and astronauts. The absence of his presence was a wound that would never truly heal. Mornings were the hardest. She would wake up and instinctively reach for his hand, only to remember that he wasn't there. She would walk past his room, still filled with the books and star maps he had loved so much, and feel the weight of loss settle deep in her chest. There were days when the pain was almost too much to bear, when all she wanted was to close her eyes and hear his voice again. But through the grief, Emily found strength. She found it in the letters and messages she received from people all over the world, parents whose children had been inspired by Jack, students who had pursued space science because of him, teachers who had started new programs in his honor. Every story was a reminder that Jack's dream hadn't died with him. It was still alive, still growing, still reaching for the stars. She dedicated herself completely to Jack's legacy foundation, traveling across the country to speak at schools, hospitals, and space institutions. She met with terminally ill children who, like Jack, had dreams too big for their fragile bodies. She held their hands, listened to their stories, and promised them that their dreams mattered. One evening, she sat in Jack's room, looking up at the glow in the dark stars he had carefully arranged on his ceiling. Tears filled her eyes, but she smiled through them. Jack was gone, but his light had never faded, and as long as she had breath in her body, she would make sure it never did. Time moved forward, but Jack's presence never faded. His name, once spoken only within the walls of his home, had spread across the country, across classrooms, across the hearts of those who had been touched by his story. What had started as the dream of one boy had transformed into a movement, one that continued to grow year after year, like a ripple spreading across a vast cosmic ocean. In schools, Jack's story became more than just a tale of a boy who had wished upon the stars. It became a lesson of perseverance, of the boundless power of dreams, and of the extraordinary potential that could exist within a single child. Teachers introduced Jack's Star Week, a dedicated time each year when students learned about astronomy, space exploration, and the stories of those who had dared to push beyond the limits of what was possible. Some schools held rocket-building competitions. Others arranged stargazing nights where children would sit beneath the vast sky and wonder about their place in the universe, just as Jack once had. Beyond classrooms, the Starlight Scholarships, created in Jack's name, became a beacon of hope for students who longed to explore the cosmos but lacked the means to do so. Funded by generous donors who had been moved by his story, these scholarships allowed young dreamers to attend space camps, visit observatories, and even pursue degrees in astrophysics and aerospace engineering. Every year, more and more students carried Jack's dream forward, stepping into the world of science and exploration, knowing that a boy who once looked up at the stars had paved the way for them. At NASA, where Jack had once visited with wide-eyed wonder, his memory was honored in a way that ensured his spirit would forever be part of the journey to the stars. A plaque was placed within one of the training facilities, a simple yet profound tribute to the boy who had believed in the impossible. It read, "For Jack, who dreamed beyond the sky and inspired a world to follow." Astronauts who had met Jack during his visit shared his story with new recruits, reminding them that space was not just for those who were strong enough to endure the journey, but for those who dared to believe in it with all their hearts. His name was spoken in conferences, in lectures, in moments of reflection before a launch, as a reminder of why humanity continued to reach for the unknown. Even beyond Earth, Jack's impact extended further than anyone could have imagined. A group of astronomers inspired by his unwavering love for the cosmos petitioned to name an asteroid in his honor. It was a small celestial body, orbiting quietly among the countless stars, but it carried his name, a permanent fixture in the universe he had so deeply loved. For Jack's parents, Emily and Peter, the pain of losing him never disappeared, but they found solace in knowing that their son's dream had not ended with his life. Each time they received a letter from a student who had been awarded a scholarship, each time they met a child who had been inspired by Jack's journey, they knew that his spirit was still alive. He had left behind more than just a legacy. He had left behind a purpose, a mission that continued long after he was gone. The boy who had once gazed at the stars from his bedroom window had, in so many ways, become part of them. On a quiet evening, under a sky dusted with stars, a young boy named Adam lay in a hospital bed, staring out of his window at the night. His body, frail from illness, was tired, but his heart still held a quiet wonder. He had always loved space, but lately, the weight of his condition had made it hard to dream. A nurse sat beside him, her voice soft and warm. "Do you know the story of Jack?" she asked. Adam shook his head, and so she began to tell him. She spoke of a boy who had loved the stars more than anything, a boy who had spent his days learning about planets and galaxies, who had dreamed of being an astronaut even when his body was too weak to make the journey. She told him how Jack's dream had inspired a movement, how his name had been written among the stars, and how even now children across the world looked up at the night sky because of him. As she spoke, Adam's tired eyes lit up with curiosity. "Where is he now?" he asked. The nurse smiled and pointed to the sky. "Look outside. See that star shining the brightest? That's him." Adam turned his head, gazing out the window, and there it was, a golden point of light twinkling in the darkness. He didn't know if it was truly Jack's star or just another part of the endless cosmos, but in that moment, it didn't matter. He smiled, feeling something he hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. Somewhere across the world, another child was hearing Jack's story for the first time. Somewhere, another young dreamer was being inspired to reach for the stars. His story, passed from one heart to another, was still traveling, still touching lives, still igniting dreams in those who needed it most. Jack had once feared that he wouldn't have enough time to make a difference, but he had. His dream had outlived him. His spirit had endured, and his light had never faded. And as long as there were children who dared to dream, as long as there were stars in the sky to be wished upon, Jack's light would continue to shine.